Joining us now is Michael Gehlken. Michael writes for the Dallas Morning News. You can follow him on Twitter at GehlkenNFL. Michael, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. How y'all doing?
Doing great. So, everybody's got the niche on the beat, right? So you've got John Machota as Mr. iPhone videos, and it's always David Moore's first question at every press conference. And then now 2 years in a row, we've established that Michael Gehlken is Mr. Cutdown Day and is going to have all the Cutdown Day details. So,
and I just don't have the energy to keep up with all of these obscure guys. So credit to you, Gehlken.
it's a lot. It's a lot to go through. But looking at the Cutdown Day, what I guess surprised you the most, and what takeaways do you think you had from obviously not the initial 53 when they were doing some logistical maneuvering there, but what are your overall takeaways of the roster they ended up with?
Surprises, I would say of all the undrafted rookies who were waived, Francis Bernard was probably the biggest surprise, but even to constitute a surprise, you somewhat kick yourself because I remember you see a certain flash moments during training camp and you ask Mike McCarthy about Bernard and he speaks so highly about him, and you start to think, okay, this young guy from Utah, he's got a real chance of making this 53. And then, you see the moments that maybe aren't quite as sharp. And then you ask him, a couple of days before Cutdown Day, what kind of work have you seen on special teams? And he says he's on punt return, he's on kickoff return. Okay, but what string are you in? I'm on second string. Well, if you're an undrafted rookie linebacker trying to make this 53-man roster, you shouldn't be on second string special teams. That kind of should tell him something and really tell us something. So, probably more surprised than I felt I should have been once you kind of piece everything together. But yeah, not a ton of surprises. I thought, if anything, this Cowboys roster reduction really showed how savvy I think this front office is when rather than having to, waive a young player like maybe a Sean McCune, tight end out of Michigan who they really like as a fourth tight end. If you waive him, you risk losing him to another team. You risk losing him on waivers. So you keep a guy like that and then release Justin March, and they release, these veterans, Joe Thomas, CJ Goodwin, with these little kind of silent little agreements. Not silent, they talk about beforehand, hey, we're going to cut you. You're a vested veteran. You're not going to go on waivers. So we're not going to lose you. You hang tight. Don't leave town. We're cutting you on Saturday. You'll be back on the roster by Monday morning. You'll be back on the roster on Sunday. So I just thought they did a really nice job navigating everything that comes with roster reductions and all the rules associated with waivers. So those are some of my bigger takeaways.
How about Lel Collins? We kept being told there's nothing going on with him, right? And we were told it's an in-shape issue. And then now he's got an injury. What are you hearing about him? I did think that was interesting that now all of a sudden he's IR.
Yeah, well, he's certainly injured right now. I think one of the points of confusion early on is that we heard there's multiple things going on with Lyle, and there was some conditioning aspects to the situation where they felt like, not saying it's the only thing going on with Lyle, but conditioning was part of it, and there wasn't any details about anything beyond that. And so it certainly would have been an opportunity to kind of point us to an injury there. And it's a hip issue that will keep him out for at least the first 3 weeks of the season, which is unfortunate not only for Lyle, but obviously the Cowboys. I mean, what a dominant season that was for him last year, coming off the big contract. So we all know what Lyle Collins can do when healthy. It's a huge loss to go from him to anyone else in terms of drop-off. But we'll see what Cam Irving can bring on Sunday night against the Rams.
And staying with that line, we talked to Mike McCarthy about this in one of our press conferences about Sean Lee. I mean, he hasn't gotten hardly any interaction with him, certainly not on the football field. Obviously, he's been able to watch him from afar. He even went so far as to say he was a fan of him when he was in high school. Are you surprised the Cowboys continue to stick it out with Sean Lee? I think if you cover this team and you cover Sean, it's not that big of a stretch. But to the fans might wonder why they continue holding on to him, who just, after he was healthy last year, what a bummer for this guy to once again have a camp where he's injured.
Yeah, well, I think the game has changed so much over the past several years where, look at the Rams, for example. They're going to be in 11 personnel, one running back, one tight end, 3 wide receivers for, I would say, expectation would be almost 3/4 of this game. And so you're not going to be in your base defense, which means you're not going to have Sean Lee, if healthy, even on the field. It's going to be Jalen Smith, and it's going to be Leighton Vander Esch. And so with the way that the game has changed, having that third linebacker, ideally, it would be someone who plays a lot more special teams than Sean Lee provides. And so that's not to dismiss that point. But, overall, he's a guy who we've seen, I think it was against the Rams last year, where he had an incredible game. He can step in with you. He's great. He can step in when you need him to. He's shown when he's healthy. He's great in your room. He's essentially like a coach, and he's been phenomenal for those young guys. I mean, some of the young guys in the defense are willing to learn from him, and they do. Other ones, over the course of time, as they maybe develop more and mature more, they kind of see the value of what it's like to have a guy like Sean Lee in your locker room. I think they're asking him to do. I think overall he brings a lot to the organization. That's not to say he's not without his shortfalls. Again, special teams being among them, but I think the team could do a lot worse for its third linebacker who won't see the field unless the team's in base or heavy personnel.
I'm just wondering when they're going to make him sort of a Kellen Moore in the building, right? Like at some point, are we going to see that from Sean Lee? But to your point, I think, especially after seeing him play last year, it was one of his better years. It is a little bit hard to sever ties with him, even with it being a new coaching staff. Sorry, Bobby, just wanted to just chime in there real quick.
And continuing on that line of thinking, I guess, in terms of like how valuable he is, particularly as a locker room presence, which is something you just mentioned there. I think that last year, a lot of us were in agreement that, and I know this was your first year on the Cowboys beat, but a lot of us were in agreement that that was one of the best Cowboys rosters from a talent perspective that we had seen in a long time. And there was no doubt the amount of talent that they had. They were, in the games that they were winning, they were beating teams down oftentimes. I think everybody in the end kind of looked at it and said there were potentially some chemistry issues or some leadership issues that were really at play there that kind of explain why such a talented team went 8-8. How much do you think that is the biggest question, I guess, for them heading into this season is the chemistry and the leadership questions rather than the talent questions?
Well, I don't think talent anymore is the question. Honestly, I think last year, everything I heard upon arrival on the beat was just how talented the Cowboys were, but I think that might not have been totally true. I think they were not talented enough on special teams, for example. They were abysmal there. They just were really, really shorthanded in some key areas, and they showed up again and again. And that New England game comes to mind where you have an organization in the Patriots that just invests so much on special teams. You have so many guys who do almost nothing else on that roster except special teams. They specialize as specialists. And the Cowboys went up in a really yucky weather type of a game, and the only touchdown, I believe, that was scored that game was off of a block punt or something along the lines. It was this total special teams breakdown, and that was the difference with their all-pro guy coming in and blocking it. So I feel like the talent of the roster construction overall over the course of the year proved itself not to be what was hoped. I do think the talent is better this year. I think the offense is at another level with the depth that the receiving core provides. I think Tony Pollard being another year, them trying to figure out ways to use him and Zeke in unison, I think it's going to be really fun to see how creative they get there. The tight end group with Blake Jarwin, he adds a different dynamic from an athleticism standpoint. So not to overlook questions on the offensive line was certainly Travis Frederick's loss, even if you're a Joe Looney fan, which I think you have reason to be. This is still nonetheless a huge loss from what he brings from a mental standpoint to that unit. But defensively, I think they're going to be able to get after the quarterback a lot more effectively, even with questions about Alden Smith and what we're getting here in 2020 after the long layoff. Everson Griffin as a rotational guy, this is what he is right now. They should really wreak havoc. So talent, I think, is better this year. I don't have questions there. Maturity, I think is better too. I think there was a bit of identity crisis last year where I don't want to single anyone out, and so I won't. But I think when you look at there were times last season where 12 men are on the field and as a defense, and they don't call a timeout, and or a part of me was that they had 10 men on the field. They remain short on defense. They don't call a timeout, and then they give up a huge screenplay against the Vikings, I believe.
Yep.
And then it was Jalen Smith, week 16, a critical game against the Eagles. he, as a Mike linebacker, is relaying all the play calls to his teammates, and it was supposed to be a man or a zone. Instead, he he mixes it up to teammate Malcolm Smith, and it's a huge play and the biggest game of the year. I just don't think the leadership, again, which isn't dependent on one player, but I just think overall the leadership was really organic. It seemed forced. Michael Bennett shows up in a midseason trade, and he's the loudest guy in your locker room. There just seemed to be times where it just didn't feel like a playoff caliber team, and golly, they had every opportunity to be a playoff caliber team in such a weak division. And the fact that they squandered it, I think, tells you about a bit about their talent, and I think it tells you about their chemistry as well. I have higher hopes this year based on Leighton Vander Esch being the Mike linebacker, and Jalen is just such a more natural of a will. I mean, he had an incredible training camp. I mean, he's probably, if you're asking me up to the first week of training camp, that's the best week of practice I've seen from an off-ball linebacker in my career. He was just so disruptive in the passing game and just all over the field. He was just sideline to sideline, truly. So, long answer to a good question, Bobby. But I think the talent and the chemistry, for me, having been around it now this is year 2 and having something of a frame of reference, I think both arrows are pointing in the right direction.
Your impressions of camp so far, because I have covered this team for, I think this will be my 7th year. Ninth year. And there's been a couple of coaches here while I've been covering this beat. What has stood out to me was, one, no music in practice, save for the water breaks. But we're not seeing Mike McCarthy doing jumping jacks with the team. It just doesn't seem like there's sort of this. I always felt they were putting on a show with the stretching exercises. And this is not a slap in the face of Jason Garrett. But even just the way they get to work, it is so intentional to me. It is fundamentally sound to me. And then we keep talking about taking the ball away. That applies even to offense, not getting the ball taken away from offensive players. What's been your impression of just camp observations under this new regime?
I think it's been interesting to see the way that Mike McCarthy manages a practice, which is that if the quarterbacks are doing something, he's not necessarily right there. He might be off to the side talking to Will McClay, talking to Stephen Jones, talking to Jerry Jones, talking to, just some of the brain trust that the Cowboys have. And just taking that CEO approach to being a football coach, he's very hands-off. I didn't necessarily know what to expect one way or the other, but that's a little unlike what I've seen in the past. So I think that's probably one of the biggest takeaways from a pure big picture standpoint. If we're going more micro, that's probably the worst offensive tackle play I've seen. It was ridiculous watching Wyatt Miller try to stop DeMarcus Lawrence every day. Great experience for Wyatt, who's no longer with the team, be it 53rd-man roster or practice squad. But I think maybe he might be on IR with a minor injury. But you just I think that was really eye-catching with this camp. I was really eager to evaluate Alden Smith and Bradley and Nye and some of those edge guys. But I thought it was really difficult because Anai was highly disruptive, but he was what he should be when going up against, a guy from Mexico who's playing American football, professional football for the first time, and is going to be part of the international player pathway program. How much do you read into Anai's dominance when that's kind of the level of competition, which is not at all a slight to that offensive tackle, but it's just being realist with where those offensive tackles' experience level at this camp.
And I also thought, I don't know if this was Mike McCarthy being sneaky or more to the substitution that he likes, the flexibility, the diversity he likes with some of his position groups. I never got a really good feel for who was with the ones, who were with the twos. For me, it was hard to track practice because I felt like he was mixing it up so much. Am I missing out on something? Did you see something different?
No, there was a lot of fluidity. I would agree. I wonder how much of that was some of the stuff that you would do in the spring and during.
That's why I don't have a handle on. So that's why I was kind of curious. Is that going to obviously be different when we can't watch 3 hours of practice? We're only going to get to watch 30 minutes this week.
Yeah, I've no doubt that, especially now that we're in game week, the ones they work with the ones, the twos, and the threes will barely see the field. They'll just be given ones and maybe even twos will look, mostly the ones. I think the secondary was probably the most fluid position group that we saw. And some of that is just because they really want to cross-train these guys. And so we saw, Daryl Worley, who's played a little bit of safety in this league, see a good amount of reps. They moved Reggie Robinson from corner to safety. They talked about doing something similar with Cheeto, but then he got hurt, and so I think that limited them doing so. I wonder if some of that is just maybe COVID reasons where you just don't know when you're going to lose a guy. But I think it might just be coming down to basic principles of how this coaching staff wants their secondary to operate, where you hear about your offensive line, you want to cross-train it so that if you lose one of your five, the guy that steps in, you'll still have your best five offensive linemen on the field. They almost seem to be taking that sort of same offensive line approach with their secondary, where if we're in our base defense and we're going to have our four defensive backs on the field, we want our best four DBs to be on the field, our nickel, our best five, and dime our best six. And so there's all this mixing and matching, I think, that might be true to that theory, that philosophy.
We talk about the differences, some of the stark differences, I guess, that have come when we look at training camp going from Jason Garrett to Mike McCarthy. One thing that seems to have been held over from Jason Garrett to Mike McCarthy is just complete muddiness and a lack of clarity about Amari Cooper's health, since neither one of them ever seemed to want to give us a straight answer about whether or not he was healthy when it seemed pretty obvious that he was hurt. In fact, we'll play a clip real quick of his answer last week when Calvin Watkins and Clarence Hill asked him about it.
How you guys have handled the thought process of how you've handled Amari Cooper snaps in practice the last 2 or 3 days?
Well, I mean, it's just like any player. I mean, there's mathematical information that goes into, where we think they are individually. What we're trying to accomplish as a position. What conceptually the things that he's done with the quarterbacks, particularly Dak. So, I mean, all those things go into account. The wear and tear on each player is factored into that. I mean, it's, Amari is the most experienced receiver of our group. So, I mean, that's part of the equation. So, I mean, he's, there's a reason why coaches work the hours and the support staff work the hours that they do. And so it's all done for a reason.
So there's no injury there, no injury going on with him at all, or worry about an injury?
I mean, it's training camp. You know, everybody has, you know, a little bit of something. So I just think it's, you know, once again, where every player is, Amari, you know, all the guys. So I mean, it's a part of really why, you know, today with the weather and, you know, not wanting to practice on turf, you know, consecutively like we have been. We have the new field now, so these are all, you know, examples of why you formulate a plan and you have the ability to adjust it. So, yeah, I feel very good about where Amari is, but you know, if he needs to take less reps, or you know, once again, these are all things that are communicated between the strength coach, the trainer, the position coach. So it's a lot goes into this.
Okay, so looking at that answer that he gives to is Amari Cooper healthy, it seems like a pretty straightforward question that didn't get much of a straightforward answer. Where do you think Amari Cooper is health-wise, and why do you think it is? We're going on about a year now of just unclear answers from the Cowboys as a whole about where Amari Cooper is with his health.
Yeah, it's a great question. My read on the situation is kind of developed, I think, with it. When McCarthy starts talking about, you know, math and, you know, kind of a vague explanation as to what the situation was, I was thinking, well, let's see. Every NFL team has these trackers in their shoulder pads that tells them how much a player is moving and how many miles he's traveling and all those sorts of measurables. So maybe they're trying to keep Amari fresh for the season because, you know, there's been a lot of, you know, wear on that tire over the course of camp. They're trying to keep him fresh. And then he keeps missing practice. And then he's working with the trainer to the side with the resistance cords. And it's very clear that Amari Cooper has some measure of an injury.
And Michael, he's not that much older than Michael Gallup. and we didn't see a ton of Amari Cooper at times last year. So I'm sitting there going, wear and tear on the tires. I'm a little confused on that one. Michael
Right.
Thomas isn't getting limited in New Orleans.
Yeah, well,
wear and tear.
Yeah, 'cause I think one of the things that Amari needs to show this season, he signed a huge contract that essentially is a 2-year deal, though, when you really look at the way that it's structured, where it's 2020, it's 2021, and then 2022, the Cowboys have a decision to make, not only with Amari Cooper, because they can get out of his deal with negligible amount of dead money, but they also have Michael Gallup, and his contract expiring that same offseason. So that's kind of where we're all pointing to, is that we have these 3 wide receivers that on paper are fantastic. They want to get 1,000 yards, each of them together this season, and they very well could if it's a 16-game year. But Amari has to show something still. You know, by nature of his contract, by nature of the time that he spent in this league, he should be the most established of the wide receivers. He should be the one with the fewest number of question marks associated with them. I've covered Amari, who I respect the heck out of as a person and as a player too. I covered him now with the Cowboys going into year 2, but I also covered him some with the Raiders. And there is a commonality to what I've been able to see, which is that it's difficult sometimes to explain what's going on with Amari Cooper. He's been one of the more perplexing players that I've covered, because there are games where he just terrorizes a secondary. He is a game wrecker. He can, at any point in the season, he's capable of going off for 200 yards. He's shown that. But there are the stretches that come between where you scratch your head and wonder, what happened to the other Amari Cooper? And the best explanation that has been provided to me along the way of, asking questions about what's going on is that, and I'm trying to be careful because I want to,
Diplomatic, sure.
carefully. But yeah, there were games last season where third down, a critical third down or critical fourth down, and you want your best players on the field. I mean, that's like backyard football. If the game's on the line, you want the tallest kid down the street on the corner to be on the field and just run up and go get it. And you want to turn your best.
Cowboys, Eagles on the road, Michael?
Yeah, and Amari's not on the field. He's on the sideline. And we asked him about it afterward, and he said that he was pulled. I think he said from the game, there was part of the rotation. And he was asked, and I thought this is probably the best, most timely question I've ever seen be posed to Amari. Well, shouldn't you say, no, I'm staying on that field? Refuse to be pulled off that field? And there are guys I've covered, like Keenan Allen from the Chargers. He's got a dog mentality about him, which is one of the best qualities that you can say a player has. He's just got a dog mentality. I think wide receivers, some guys have a dog mentality where they are going to scrap, they're going to fight, they're just going to, if it's a critical third down and they're lining up in the slot going against the best nickel corner in the league and it's an inside slant and the guy's got inside leverage, he's still going to find a way to get to his spot so that the quarterback can hit him and they can convert and keep the chains going and stay on the field. That's a dog mentality. I think one thing that we need to watch this season, and one thing I think the Cowboys surely are watching over the next 2 years before their decision is a dog there? Does he have that dog mentality? Because I think CD's a dog. I'm pretty sure Michael Gallup's a dog based on what we've seen. And
Gallup's a dog in a different way, don't you think, Gehlken? It's not
I don't know
obvious
what breed
with
of dog
him.
he is, but I'm saying he's a dog.
Right, but what I'm saying about him is people don't see this the characteristic we typically see and what you're alluding to with the wide receiver, like Michael Irvin is what you think of when you think of a brash, confident wide receiver in Dallas. With Gallup, he just really wants to succeed. He's like the kid that wants the gold ribbon at the end of the game. He wants the pat on the head. He wants to get better. He wants to be involved. I think that's the thing that's always sort of stood out to me about Gallup. Whereas with Amari, it's like there's like this analytical, like almost like he like devoid of emotion. It's fascinating. He's like the anti-wide receiver.
Right. I think we always talk about how he plays chess in the locker room. He's very analytical, and that applies to the game. His personality, they're kind of somewhat, he approaches his routes and all that. There comes a time where you just need to flip over the chessboard and just, change the game. And I think that's what Amari, that's something that people want to see from him, is just, I don't think he's very well injured right now. And I'm not saying that that's what's happening in practice, why he's missing practice. We'll see what, on the injury report this week, what he's got, what the ailment is, and everything like that. But I think overall, more broadly, that's probably, I think, the fairest criticism of Amari that you can make. And we'll see how that shows itself to be. I think he's got lots to show still. And he's got, there's no reason that this guy, shouldn't post more yards than he already does. He's that talented. He's that good. He's that skilled. He's that nuanced and that fine-tuned in his route running. And he's sensational in so many things that he does. But I think it's within him to take his game to even another level. And we'll see whether or not he can do that this year. And maybe helps having such a crowded wide receiver chart where he doesn't need to be that quote-unquote one every single week. That ball, there's only one of it. And so Dak's going to spread it around, and we'll see how it all shakes out.
I think it's interesting you referencing that Philly game and when he came out of – when he was at practice the next week and he got asked about it. And he said, well, that's rotation. I got pulled. That's not up to me. And we asked questions around the building that week, and it was, said that Sanjay Lal was in charge of the rotation. And there were times where it seemed like they butted heads sometimes. How much of the issues do you think we saw? Do you think there were issues, is basically what I'm saying, between that chemistry between Sanjay Lal and Amari Cooper that maybe explain away some of the issues we saw in the second half of last year?
I would be unqualified to really speak on it. I would have to do some more legwork there to say. I mean, the Cowboys chose not to bring Sanjay Lal back, but I don't know if that's necessarily an indictment that I'd be willing to attach to that answer. I just don't know. I would be speaking out of turn. I think it's a fair question, but I wouldn't be positioned to answer it.
To answer your question, Bobby, I've asked that very question. I never got the sense that there was problems between the two. I do think that Amari asks a lot of questions and wants answers to those questions. And I think sometimes when you try to provide those answers and they aren't enough, I think it can lead to frustration. But I never got the sense that it was these two didn't get along and this is why that didn't work. I mean, we saw the departure of Gary Brown, and there were no issues with him and Ezekiel Elliott. Right. So, I've got one more question for you, Gehlken, before we let you go. Every beat writer, unfortunately, can't take a day off because this Earl Thomas to Dallas thing has lingered. I've been doing this before you got here on the Earl Thomas storyline, and quite frankly, it's exhausting. I've joked it's sort of the never-ending story. You've got just as many sources in the building as I do. Can you put this to bed for the fans? In other words, the Earl Thomas interest is there or it isn't?
Well, the Cowboys had interest. There was initial interest. I think anytime a 7-time Pro Bowler becomes available at your greatest position of need, you're going to talk about it. The issue, of course, with Earl Thomas, I think it's probably twofold. One, is he a true 7-time Pro Bowler in form in terms of, is that what you're going to get? A guy who's today a Pro Bowler? And whatever that's worth, I realize, set aside Pro Bowl voting. But number two, the Baltimore Ravens and the Seattle Seahawks are two of the finest run organizations in football. From a personnel department standpoint, you'd be hard-pressed to find two more respected front offices than those. Seahawks had him while he was playing at an elite level, and at some point along the way decided, it's time to part ways. Baltimore Ravens pick him up, take a look at, again, skill set, and then maybe the other part of what a player is in terms of in your locker room and your building, decide this isn't worth keeping on our club, and they move in a different direction. In very tight intervals, both those organizations move on. So Cowboys see that Earl Thomas becomes available. I mean, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to vet a player. They're going to do research. They're going to make phone calls, and they're going to get an idea of what exactly they'd be getting by bringing Earl Thomas into their building. What followed was silence. Silence in terms of contract discussions, silence in terms of making an effort to bring Earl Thomas to Dallas. I think that silence should be as telling as anything I could say or you, Jane, could say about where the Cowboys stand today on Earl Thomas. I mean, you wanted to be an optimist and think it's going to happen. You always, veterans sign him after week 1, their salary doesn't come guaranteed and all that, but I just don't think that applies here.
With that being said, one other layer, I was talking to a Ravens source today, and that organization has not had any contact with anybody from the Cowboys inquiring about Earl Thomas. In other words, there has been no vetting or even discussions about that particular player, which I thought was interesting and should also speak to, they're going to do their due diligence. Someone would have picked up the phone. That phone is not ring about that particular player.
Any research they need to do now, they can just ask Brandon Carr, who stood next to him in the defensive backfield last week.
Well, and Gehlken, before we let you go, I lied to you. Just listening to Brandon talk today, and I had even talked to the Ravens about Carr, and they said that this is a willing tackler. They think that he's better. I think it was, free safety is what they thought that he was a little bit more natural at, that he made that transition. Let me see if I can't pull that up. That he made that transition well. Great deep safety. They think he'd be great working against the tight ends. And then when I talked to the Cowboys, they noted all of these positions that he can play along the field. How quick do you think it is before we see him move up from the veteran practice squad? And how easy is that given this new system?
Yeah, so it helped that he had his free agent workout, so he was able to start the COVID testing, and so he'll be able to have a full practice week. It's not like where Randy Gregory was there. He became cleared on Monday. He was able to begin COVID testing. Like, he wouldn't be eligible to be with the Cowboys at practice if he could practice on Wednesday. That's not something Randy Gregory could do, but that's something that Brandon Carr can do. So he's got a bit of a leg up in terms of just getting ready for a Sunday game. If you think to how NFL training camps, though, this season have been structured, there's been a lengthy strength and conditioning acclimation period where even if, as Brandon Carr has said, I've been training all off season. That's fine. A lot of players have been training all offseason, but yet the NFL Players Association found it prudent for anyone to start training camp to have a more gradual acclimation. And so, the Cowboys had a program for Dontari Poe when coming off of PUP. They had a program for Everson Griffin after they signed him. They were easing these guys along in practice, just doing individual drills or just doing strength and conditioning before they actually had them do team drills, much less learn a playbook and communicate in the back end of a defense, against a team that likes to pass as much as the Ravens do, or as the Rams do. So I would be a little surprised if we saw them, say, start on Sunday. Maybe they would call him up from the practice squad. You can do that with 2 guys. But I also wouldn't be surprised at all if he's not active at all for at least the time being. His time without is coming. He's going to be a big part of this defense.
All right. Well, Michael, we appreciate you joining us today. Everybody, as I told you, you can go follow him on Twitter at Gehlken NFL. Jane, I won't ask you to spell Gehlken. It's Gehlken. I've learned where that H goes. That's always the trickiest part of it, but I've learned where the H goes. So that's where you can follow him. Michael, we appreciate you, man.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. If you would do us a favor, hit subscribe over here. And if you want more Cowboys content, you can check it out over here. Thanks again for watching.